tonight. Matthew will be talking to us about what's burnout and blame. He's come all the way from Brighton to give this talk, so thank you.
You're welcome.
And over to you.
Thank you. I have a question for you all. Have you ever felt like this? Every day is a struggle. You feel exhausted, yet you can't sleep properly. You can just about hang on until Friday afternoon, but the dread of Monday morning spreads across the whole weekend, and you can never relax properly. Worse, you're starting to feel ill. You have a headache all the time, and your digestion isn't working so well. You feel trapped, and it's hard to care about anything much at all. If this sounds familiar, you could be experiencing burnout. Burnout happens when you have a demanding role, but your needs aren't met by what you're doing. It's a combination of your own personal circumstances and the way that a workplace is structured. Tonight, we're going to talk about how you can work more effectively, find flow and avoid burnout. We're going to talk about how we as IT professionals can help build organisations which foster creativity and growth, not exhaustion. Before we get to solving burnout, it's helpful to think about some of the things that cause it in the first place. Burnout comes from a misalignment between your environment, your goals, and how you're trying to reach them. These are some of the major risk factors. Lack of control, particularly over things that you're personally responsible for. Lack of fairness, with different people in the organisation being treated in different ways. Lack of community and the absence of trust. Lack of meaningful work, particularly when that work isn't aligned to your values. And finally, lack of rest and reflection, just constant work overload. Burnout can be quite hard to pin down because it's such a personal thing. My toxic environment may be your ideal workplace. It's also something that people can endure for relatively short periods of time just to get something done. However, if the situation doesn't improve for the better, or you don't take control and change things for yourself, you can end up stuck in a negative cycle where you don't have the energy to get out. The good news is that it is possible to break that cycle. For your work to be satisfying, it must be meaningful. For it to be meaningful, it must be aligned to your values. Doing work which you find satisfying can be the single difference between going home at the end of the day happy that you've achieved something and going home feeling that you've been banging your head against a brick wall. For me, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche summed this up well. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. In a recent study, researchers found that meaningful work was a major protective factor against workplace anxiety. That alone was enough to transform a stressful experience into a far more tolerable one. As values are so important to meaningful work, let's do a quick thought experiment. Can you list, just in your head, your top 5 values? I'll give you a few seconds. I'm sorry, that's a mean thing to do. The odd thing about values is that they're really, really hard to bring to mind. They're just part of the way we think most of the time. We only really notice them when they're challenged in some way. Slightly misaligned values can be really hard to spot. There are few communists working in the City of London and few vegans working in butcher shops. But there are many millions of people working in jobs for which they care very little and which just pay the bills. In the long run, this isn't a psychologically healthy place to be. So, to give you a quick start on finding some of your own values, this is a list of those that other people commonly report. Now, I'd like you to take a look through and see if any particularly jump out at you. For me, I'm particularly driven by curiosity and also by learning. But I'd really like, actually, if anyone feels brave enough, if any of those really jump out at you, to share what you feel. Cool. Anyone else? Anything? Community.
Fairness.
Yeah. Excellent.
Trustworthiness.
interesting. It's really interesting. A lot of these are actually things that we all want, really. But the key thing is to focus down on maybe 3 to 5 that are the things that really matter to you, that really affect you. And that gives you a bit more ability to actually achieve them, because if you're too widely spread, it can be very difficult. So you'll have more energy and more satisfaction from work if you can find a job that's really meaningful, that is aligned to your values. And one of the benefits of putting in the effort to find that is that you'll be better protected from burnout. One reason that doing something you believe in helps is that you're more able to engage your entire brain in the task that you're doing. When you're doing something you're not really sure about, a part of your brain is always checking for something that might be more rewarding. That could be a different piece of work, it could be a conversation with a colleague, or it could even be lunch. The brain switches rapidly between the task you're trying to focus on and the distraction. The trouble is, all that switching comes at a cost. Even before you're fully distracted, the thing that you're trying to focus on isn't getting your brain's full resources. This situation can become a chronic feedback loop. If you're constantly distracted by urgent tasks, never really solving any one of them, constantly switching between them, you can get stuck. And that's a real risk factor for burnout, and one of the reasons that lack of control is so important. Getting a stream of unpredictable, urgent tasks is really tough to manage, and constantly trying to triage, never solving any single one of them, is extremely stressful. And this might sound a little daunting, particularly if you're already on the way to burning out. But there are some things you can do to help. One of them is to make sure that you get the rest you need to recover. Use a timer to remind you to take a break away from the computer. If you rest regularly, you get much more done in the long run. The trick is to actually start to take a break before you think you really need it. And not all breaks are created equal either. The ideal break gets you some exercise, gets you outside, and includes some socialisation. A walk around a nearby green space with a friend is absolutely the ideal thing. But any one part of those is better than, say, checking social media or checking the news, both of which are associated with lower mood. And don't feel guilty about taking breaks. After all, the rest is actually part of the work. Now, I don't want to give the impression tonight that work is just a bad thing, that it's something to be avoided and to be minimised. It can be a sense of huge satisfaction and enjoyment. The trouble is, it can be really tough to decide what you really want to do, and it can be even tougher to convince your colleagues that that's a good idea. They said, dress for the job you want, not the job you have. Now I'm sat in a disciplinary meeting wearing a Batman outfit. So how do you know what work you really should be doing? How do you know what's actually worth struggling for? One way is to look at what you find the most rewarding. Now, there are 2 different types of personal reward that we can get from work. The first, we've already touched on, is doing work which you find satisfying. When you do something that makes the world slightly better in a way that aligns with your values, you feel reward. It's a good thing to do. The second is the pleasure that we get from doing the work itself whilst we're doing it. And that's what we're going to talk about next. In his book Flow, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about the deep pleasure people experience when fully immersed in a task. Think back to a time when you were doing something. It felt effortless and automatic. Time passed without you really noticing, and you were completely absorbed in what you were doing. When you look back, you've been performing at your best too. This is a flow state. Can you remember a time when you've experienced this? And maybe think about what you were doing. People often give the examples of playing music, playing sport, or playing computer games as times that they've experienced flow state. And for most people, flow is a rare event at work, but this doesn't have to be the case. Many people with traditional working lives, such as farmers and hunters, regularly report being in flow. And so do people with practical jobs, such as surgeons. Indeed, some IT professionals do report being in flow, usually either when programming or when working on a particularly tricky problem with colleagues. You see, it's not the category of work that we're doing that determines whether we can reach this state of effortless, enjoyable activity. It's the qualities of the task itself and the environment that we're working in. The first thing necessary for flow is that the task has a clearly defined self-set goal, and it really helps if that goal contributes to something bigger and more meaningful too. The next thing is that feedback towards that goal must be immediate and tangible. You need to see yourself making progress for flow to continue. Finally, the work must be difficult enough to be challenging, but not so difficult that it becomes frustrating. There's a sweet spot of difficulty where we perform at our best. This is the Yerkes-Dodson law. It's a psychology theory which maps emotional arousal and task performance. There's a peak on the curve where we're performing at our best. It's neither complete relaxation nor blind panic, but it's somewhere in between the two. As you get better at a task, as you get more practiced, the sweet spot moves to the right. You need more pressure to excel at something that you're already good at. And you can use the environment to give you any extra pressure that you need. Social commitments, for example, can be really, really strong motivators. If you want to get something done, make a hard-to-break social commitment. You could, for example, offer to give a talk to your local BCS branch. Another good way to give yourself the pressure you need is to create imminent deadlines. Have you ever wondered why it's hard to worry about things in the far future, but comparatively minor things in the near future can seem absolutely terrifying? The more distant the deadline, the less we care because of a bias called hyperbolic discounting. We don't have a linear relationship with the future. Things, even very serious things that are a long way off, are really easy to ignore. So break a task up into chunks which are small enough to be achievable in a relatively short space of time. That way you will have feedback about your progress and imminent deadlines. This, along with being well rested, will make flow more likely. The thing is, much like falling asleep, you can't make flow happen directly. You can just create the circumstances in which it's more likely to happen. Once it does happen, the last thing you want is for that flow to be broken. Distractions can be hugely disruptive to flow. Many tasks require complex mental models to be built up before any real progress can be made. And distractions cause these models to be forgotten. Mental models are often fragile things, and like a spider's web, they can be swept away at a single stroke. It's much, much harder to build the model a second time. Our brains prefer novelty, so following that thread through rebuilding that model is much, much less enjoyable, much less compelling, and that makes returning to flow that much less likely. Take steps to manage distractions. Many open plan offices use the headphone rule, in which people wearing headphones shouldn't be disturbed, and emails don't need to be responded to immediately that they arrive either. Phone notifications are a particularly pernicious distraction. Many applications are just designed to capture and hold your attention. This is absolutely in the interest of the application vendor. They get more usage, but really you should consider whether it's in yours. If you do nothing else as a result of this talk, please go through your phone and disable as many notifications as you possibly can. And be brutal about it too, because you can always turn them back on again if you really, really need them. In IT, we have another occupationally specific distraction problem. We work at a computer much of the day, and that means that we have the most useful and yet the most distracting thing ever created right at our fingertips, the internet. And worse, we can't really turn it off because we need it for our jobs. As technology pioneer Mitch Kapoor said, getting information off the internet is like taking a drink from a fire hydrant. There are some tools which you can use to help, which block access to specific websites according to a preset schedule. Whilst they don't solve the problem completely, they do start to break the habit of completely mindless distraction. They allow you to make a conscious choice instead of endlessly clicking through listicles and quizzes. And you'll likely get by not knowing what piece of IKEA furniture you are. And this is indeed a real quiz, and in case you were wondering, I'm the upland bed. If you can focus on single tasks, take regular breaks and remove distractions, you'll achieve a lot more at the end of the day, and you'll have more energy for the next day as well. You'll be less tired and you'll be ready to do your best. You're setting yourself up for more success, and you'll both protect yourself from burnout and increase your chances of finding flow. If you struggle though, please don't take this as a personal failing. A lot of the advice I've given so far is about controlling your environment, and there are limits to what you can do on your own. A lot of that environment is dictated by your employer, and this is not always a good thing. The desire to control staff behaviour is at the root of a huge amount of self-destructive management decisions. The problem is frontline staff tend to know best how to do their jobs. Modern workplaces are complex systems built upon complex systems, and they defy straightforward command and control. Frequently, IT is the vehicle of such policies, even if it's not the originator. It's us that takes the hit, the reputational hit, when we fail to stand up for our users. We need to deliver systems which allow for the unexpected. A prescriptive system prevents staff from responding to unanticipated events. Let's take an IT service desk as an example. The goal of the service desk is to resolve technical issues as quickly and efficiently as possible. The problem is, not every user is calling because they have a technical issue in need of resolution. Some of them are calling because using a computer makes them feel stupid and they want to feel better about themselves. Others are calling because they need an excuse for having failed to do a piece of work that they should have. If you focus purely on technical resolution, you won't meet these needs. If you have a ticket closure target and a mandatory conversation flowchart, staff have no opportunity to solve the problem that's actually in front of them. Support teams are not only prevented from winning, they're prevented from playing the right game in the first place. And that's stressful for everyone involved. If you don't have a mechanism to detect that something has gone wrong with your process, then the organisation cannot improve. And this is a particular problem for tightly coupled processes like car manufacturing, and the Toyota production method has a solution. It's called the and-on cord. Now, the and-on cord runs the length of a production line, and it's within easy reach of all of the workers. Staff are trained to pull the cord if they see anything wrong with the car that they're working on. Immediately they do, the production line stops and a supervisor attends to see what the problem is. Now, the very first thing that supervisor does is thank the member of staff for pulling the cord. And that might seem like a really odd thing to do. Each pull of the cord costs thousands of pounds in lost productivity, and depending on the stage of manufacturing, could potentially ruin a whole car. The thing is, staff already know that. They know that in pulling the cord, they risk angering both their colleagues and their bosses. By thanking them, the supervisor emphasises that it's more important to fix the systematic issue than it is to carry on working on that one individual car. Once the issue is resolved, production continues until the next time the cord is pulled. Now, I'd like to turn this over to everyone in the room and ask whether you've had any experiences of either spotting and raising issues in your workplace, or whether you've spotted issues but chosen not to raise them, and perhaps share why. Does anyone feel brave enough to...
Process issues?
Yeah?
Something not working?
Mm-hmm.
Saying this does not work, and result being people saying, I know, I'm just not doing anything about it, which is somewhat depressing.
Yeah, definitely.
In a previous job I had, the budgets seemed to buy hardware, and they would throw hardware at things, but there seemed to be time or budgets to train people. So in the IT support because they were never trained, but there wasn't a budget to train.
Wow.
And it was like, this is really obvious.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've had that sort of similar idea as well. I'm part of, was part of a very small law firm in Scotland, and we merged with a much larger international firm. And of course, we went in having dealt with absolutely everything for our company. So what wasn't working in the help desk is we were on the receiving end. And initially, I raised sort of issues where I said, well, you're not actually asking all the questions, so you've got high call volume because the staff are having to call 3 or 4 times to get their issue resolved. Whereas if you actually spent 5 minutes on a call as opposed to 1 minute on a call, you could actually resolve it, keep them happier. But at the time, we had a manager who just was, like you said, sort of very process driven, target driven. You had to answer a call within so many seconds, get off the call within so many seconds, and pass it on, which just didn't work. Now that she's left.
Excellent.
Things have got better.
Cool, thank you. That brings me on to my next point, really, which is that it's only worth going to the effort and the risk of raising things if you think that they're going to be fixed. You know, you think that there's actually something's going to happen. And that means that the organisation itself has to change in response to what it learns, what it's been told. The problem is, such change can be really hard, and one of the major barriers to that change is blame. Now, why is blame so harmful to progress? There are 2 significant reasons. The first is that it prevents problems from being raised at all. If you think you might get personally blamed, or the very close relative of that you might then become responsible for the problem that you've identified, then most people just choose not to raise issues at all. And they're just quietly swept under the carpet where they accumulate and cause no end of problems. But the second reason is because blaming individuals is rarely the right thing to do. It rarely gets to the root cause of the problem. The management consultant W. Edwards Deming said that a bad system will beat a good person every time. And his research suggested that 94% of work performance belongs to the system, not the individual. If you have a blame culture, that means that you're only going to be getting to the root cause 1 in every 17 times you look. To me, that's a poor strike rate. And one of the reasons that blame cultures persist is because blaming an individual is, at least in the short term, the easy thing to do. As humans, we have a bias towards explaining things in terms of the intrinsic qualities of a person. We tend to overlook the systematic and environmental effects on people's behaviour. That colleague who won't help you isn't busy and overworked. They're arrogant and mean. That person who cuts you off in traffic isn't inattentive because they're going through a difficult period in life. They're just an arse. Whenever an organisation adopts the metric of fewest mistakes, it's likely to generate a blame culture. Mistakes are always going to happen when doing complex work. And don't get me wrong, minimising mistakes is obviously a worthwhile thing to do, but it's a second order effect. You need to build processes which give rise to fewer mistakes. Otherwise, you're just blaming staff for something that they have no control over. And blame can be a really hard thing to eradicate from a workplace. It can manifest in quite subtle ways. Even if the organisation doesn't punish people directly, if the only people who are ever considered for promotion are those who don't have a mistake associated with them, then the incentives are all exactly the same. Now, the management theorist Simon Sinek describes the role of management as establishing a circle of safety. Within the circle are members of the organisation, and the older parts of our brain can interpret this as our tribe. If we feel secure in the tribe, we can take risks. We know that others will look out for us, and we know that if we do make a mistake, we won't immediately become an outcast. When we're inside the circle of safety, we can spend our energy on productive work. We can look to the outside world and make valuable changes for others. If we're outside that circle, though, perhaps it only extends to a privileged clique of senior managers, then things are very different. We have to spend all our energy maintaining our position and protecting ourselves. We can't do anything for anyone else when we're busy fighting for our own survival. And one major threat to feeling safe at work is performance measurement. In a complex organisation, it can be extremely difficult to assess employee performance. This is even harder when the value of work that people are doing is abstracted or is part of a combined effort. And this difficulty can result in some extremely dubious measurement techniques. My personal two least favourite are the amount of hours in the office and the amount of the number of lines of code written. They're both disastrous. We need to build our metrics based on genuine contributions. Failing to do this sets up perverse incentives, and it undermines morale. And this task is even harder when we're talking about agile teams or teams distributed all over the world. Now, if you work in an organisation with any aspirations towards agile, then you probably recognise Slack. It's real-time persistent chat tool with multiple channels in which people can talk about whatever they need. It's a great way to improve collaboration, and if you're of a certain vintage, it will probably kind of remind you of IRC. Slack is really popular with remote teams as well, but managing remote teams is just hard. A lot of the conventional approaches to management don't work when there are different people spread out over different time zones. You miss out on that kind of interpersonal interaction that just goes on day to day when people meet, and that makes it extremely hard to both keep an eye on how people are doing and intervene when something goes wrong. The Startup Compass provides visualizations of the way that people work together in Slack, and this is the kind of diagram that it produces. It can measure how often different people talk to one another, and it can also measure the sentiment of those conversations. This gives management insight into the differences between the way the org chart looks and the way that people are actually working together. And this kind of information can be used to identify bottlenecks and key person dependencies. It can be used to see how the flow of conversation changes over a day or over a week or over the duration of a project. It can even be used to check that interactions are both productive and psychologically safe. And Compass presents much of its data as a network graph. And in the graph we saw, the nodes are the individual employees in the organisation. But the real value of a network graph is that it shows the relationship between the nodes, not just the attributes of the nodes themselves. When you look at data this way, you can see the features of the whole system. You have insight into the way that the entire network is behaving, not just individuals within it. And it's not just the way that people that chat in Slack that can benefit from this kind of network analysis. Any large, hard to understand set of data can. It's used by insurance companies to spot unusual claimant patterns in order to detect fraud. It's used by Netflix, who combine your previous watching habits with your demographic data to predict what you should watch next. And the trouble is, making judgments about the relationship between the nodes can be tricky, and this is particularly true where people are involved. Now, I'd like you to take a look at these 6 pictures and these 6 emotions. Each one of these pictures is one of these emotions. And this task might be easier if you chat it through with someone nearby. So if you want to have a look and see what you reckon. How's everyone? I will be asking you, so if everyone's managed to get their judgment spot on, then this is the most emotionally attuned BCS that I've been to so far, so it'll be going really well. So okay, let's start then. So what do you think this one is? Yeah. How about this one?
Surprise.
Yep.
Happiness.
Yep.
Sadness.
Yep.
Distress.
Yep.
Fear.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is usually most people get them, but sometimes some people find particularly the fear and surprise emotions slightly hard to differentiate. And this is based on a piece of research by Dr. Paul Ekman into the universal emotions. It's a classic of psychology research. But it's since been criticised for the fact that, that fear and surprise actually look really similar, and some people say they are the same thing. It's also been criticised for exactly how culturally universal it is, and you have problems with how the words map to the feeling and all sorts of issues around that. Now, this gives us an idea of just how difficult it is for people to make a judgment about other people's emotions, which starts to give us an idea of how hard it is for machines to do the same thing. So the way something is said matters at least as much as the information is given, even in the workplace. And sentiment analysis is the computational assessment of the emotional component of language. Most often it's used to assess positivity and negativity, the emotional valence of the language that's used. And one very successful use of this approach is Brighton-based company Brandwatch, who look at social media postings to track how brands are perceived online. Now, determining the emotional content of natural language is far from straightforward. It requires the ability to understand the context that relevant words are used in. And to do that, you need to break the sentences down into components, and only then can you start to assess what the words really mean. And there's one area of AI which has focused on this problem more than any others, and that's chatbots. You might have seen some Google Duplex demos before, but I'd like to share this one with you because I particularly like it. And Google Duplex is one of the most sophisticated chatbots out there because it can have a spoken conversation in real time. And it can do a handful of linear tasks and only in good conditions. And it can't really deal with the unexpected. It's notable that that's a recording, not a live demo. So it's entirely plausible that that wasn't the only time that they did that before they chose to show it. But why should it be so? Why is it so difficult to do this? So to understand what makes building an effective chatbot so challenging, let's take an imaginary one apart and see how it works. So this bot is used to book airline tickets. So when it receives a statement, the bot first has to determine the intent that the user has behind the statement. Does the user want to ask about routes, flight times, or to confirm a booking? And you could do this by looking for specific statements, but that would be really quite frustrating. The user would have to guess pretty much exactly what to say. Instead, bots use machine learning to assess based on a series of likely previous statements to assess what the intent is going to be. And next, the bot has to pick out the specific items that the user is talking about, the entities, the variables. If the user says, tell me about flights to Edinburgh on the 14th of June, and I'm sorry I used Edinburgh there, but it needs to spot the destination and the date so it can do the right search. Once it's done that, it can return the correct response. The problem is, human speech is an untidy thing. It's full of subclauses, interruptions, and dangling modifiers. Not only that, but people change topic between sentences. Sometimes people change topic in the middle of sentences. How is a chatbot supposed to keep up? So many bots use a nested dialogue structure. The bot talks about the most recent task that the person has mentioned. It then finishes that and then goes back to what it was talking about before. In our example, after asking about flight availability, then the next question could be, what are the food options? On hearing and understanding that, the bot launches a food selection dialogue. Once the user has completed that, chosen their food, it goes back to the timing of the flight. Even this approach doesn't capture the full flexibility of natural speech. You can start to see why Google Duplex has to be quite so focused on specific tasks, because any increase in scope comes with a huge number of extra possibilities that you have to design for. And it's easy to take speech processing for granted because we do it absolutely so naturally. The thing is, we've had an awful lot of practice. And it turns out that that's the way to get bots to improve as well. Building in feedback and learning mechanisms is the best and most effective way to improve the performance of chatbots. And there's some exciting work going on in this area of natural language processing. It combines the network analysis that we looked at around the structure of sentences and the structure of language and with speech processing. As this kind of machine learning becomes more and more sophisticated, it will have more and more applications. Now, we're finally reaching the point at which AI can perform like a human, at least in really narrow tasks. We're at the point where natural language interfaces are the best choice for some services, for some use cases. The real power, though, comes with the ability to learn from experience and to change. Outcomes can be fed back into machine learning algorithms and performance improved on an iterative basis. And it's this ability to learn and respond to their users that will give new workplace tools their value. In IT, that means that we can start to support human-to-human transactions and to do so at scale. This means that organisations can become force multipliers, allowing people to do something far more valuable than they would on their own. The goal of IT becomes delivering friction-free, meaningful work. Now, the World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report looks forward 5 years to the workplace of 2023. It paints a picture of a challenging operating environment, particularly for companies and organisations in the developed world, because the increase of globalisation and increased competition from emerging markets will continue and get faster and faster. It paints a picture of changing technology and an increasing pace of technology adoption, with a huge shift to digital and towards automation. This implies the need for workforces and for organisations to be able to change and adapt dynamically to the new needs of the market where they find themselves. And perhaps the most relevant thing for us as the BCS is the rise of the human-machine relationship. Now, in technical jobs, we use a computer quite a lot of the time, but the World Economic Forum predict that everyone will be using a computer for significant parts of their job, even quite traditional jobs, in the future, in the relatively imminent future. So even jobs like management, which have been up until now a largely interpersonal thing, will suddenly become supported by digital systems. So as IT professionals, we have a new role, empowering staff. We design the systems which users use for more and more and more of their work. The expectation is that we're designing technical systems, but we're implicitly designing human systems too. We need to use the capability that machine learning, AI, and all this other new technology gives us to build in the interests of our users. These tools can help us build better organisations. organisations which learn and respond to the needs of their customers, organisations which adapt to the needs of their users, organisations which give staff space to perform at their best, be creative, and to find flow. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, there's some prompts if you need any, but go ahead and yeah.
From your experience in looking at semantic analysis, because I remember seeing this being mentioned as a plugin now for the Azure cloud, how accurate is it?
For sentiment analysis. It's good at doing kind of relatively obvious sentences. So it's actually extremely reliable for obvious sentences. The problem is where you've got ambiguous sentences or where you've got stuff that's contradicted. So as people, we often make a statement that goes in a certain direction and then kind of takes a bit of a turn, and sentiment analysis has a bit of a problem with that because it takes the original direction of the sentence and thinks, oh, that's a positive statement, and doesn't get that the thing was contradicted in the last 3 words.
Does it also have lots of problems with non-standard English or non-standard usage of whatever language you said? Or?
It depends on the training corpus. I can't actually. I haven't actually played with the one in Azure yet. It's quite interesting. I hadn't spotted that. I'm assuming that they're using a pretty big training corpus and improving it as it goes. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that develops. Yeah, but the challenge is at the moment a lot of the things are proprietary, and they're quite tailored to very specific tasks. So if you are, for example, Brandwatch, and you're looking at social media postings online, you're going to be dealing with one very different sort of language to the kind of language where you do, say, doing a textual analysis of literature as part of a natural language or an English kind of research project. And those two different applications are quite specialised at the moment. So yeah, have you got any particular interest in?
Well, can I follow on with that?
Yeah.
Because the example you use and the examples that Microsoft is giving up for their system is in processing, say, user and consumer, like their internal and external information.
Yeah.
So, have you heard anything about how that impacts with the GDPR compliance of algorithmic processing of user data?
It's quite difficult. There's both the GDPR and the wider ethical concerns about some of this. We're already in a position where the technology is ahead of the way that the Data Protection Act was written. And the processing of data and what that really means and what's personally identifiable within it becomes really problematic. And also the contribution of the individual user. Because when you've got the right to be forgotten, it's like, well, there's a degree of the right to be forgotten, but there's also your contribution to a learning algorithm. And how can you pull that out of a learning algorithm that's then changed based on what it's seen afterwards? So it's extraordinarily tricky. The main thing to do is to get consent and explain to users what that is. The difficulty is that really informed consent?
Well, I was also thinking because if it's making a decision on the sentiment and if that informs a further process,
yes,
then that's something that could be questioned for human review.
Yes, definitely. No, that's the bigger ethical question in quite a lot of this stuff, is that if you're making algorithmic decisions that would have previously been made by human judgment, then how do you make sure that that's done in a reasonable way, in an explicable way, potentially, and in a way that is in the interests of the people who it's actually being done to? It's also, some of these are black box AIs, so we don't really know what the basis of their decision-making framework really is. And that's even harder to regulate and manage. And it's really hard because there are some huge benefits to doing this. We could unlock a huge amount of stuff, but there are also some massive disbenefits, some massive potential problems. And we're catching up kind of societally and politically with the technology. So one of the things I'm particularly keen on, one of the solutions I particularly like, is putting as much power in the hands of users as possible. So if you're making an algorithmic judgment about people, then you share that with them as you make that judgment. So say, for example, you're writing an email and that's going to go through through some assessment process, that you have that available to surface if you want to see what the algorithm's actually going to say about that. Because at least then you have the capability of understanding what's going on before you kind of commit to something.
Other questions?
I was thinking about context and cultural different interpretations.
Mm.
How you can sort of work around that.
So how you can work around different
Well,
cultures?
it's kind of like some cultures don't see humour. Other cultures don't expect. They do expect a straightforward answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you build around that?
Yeah, but so when you're how you can account for cultural differences within a technical system within a yeah, that's a really big challenge. It's and you've got the cultural differences between countries, regions, organisations, all of which can be quite profound. And one of the risks is that you're by starting to manage this thing, you push the culture in a certain direction away from how it's evolved. And quite often these cultures have evolved for a good reason. They're very effective. Some of them aren't, but many companies and organisations just kind of do what's necessary and evolve a very complex culture. And going in and putting in a tool that isn't compatible with that simply won't work. I mean, I've seen that over and over again in less sophisticated terms. Particularly, a lot of the modern cloud tools seem to really be very difficult to implement in large organisations because they culturally don't get that way of working. They expect a degree of control and a degree of process that just isn't present in something that's just like, right, employees, here's all the stuff. And management panic and don't understand how to regulate it and don't understand how to get what they need. So yeah, I take your point completely. It's going to be a major challenge, definitely.
So, one of my team's experiences with using sort of like tools and things for kind of enhancing our work and our throughput would be sort of things for managing tasks and things like that. And our team also develops tools for helping other teams and things for like, helping their kind of throughput and things like that as well. Now, one of the things that I kind of have thought about with this, with using AI to perhaps make that a bit better, is in line with your talking about flow. So when you want to kind of write up a task and you need to allocate it to a project or you need to kind of allocate it to a person, all of this kind of breaks up the flow, especially if you're kind of thinking about it as you're going. So you notice something that needs to be refactored as you're kind of going through something, or you notice some outdated documentation as you're going through. Now, I've been trying to think about ways of how do you, like, AI must fit in there somewhere to kind of keep the flow going. So you can keep working what you're doing, but all of the approaches that I've seen from other products, things like that, that use sort of Slack integrations for like Asana or Rike and things like that, they still feel like they break flow, especially like, so chatbots, if you're typing in, you have to kind of go to another window. Even things like where some teams I've spoken to have experimented with like Alexa, where they'll sort of they'll at their desk sort of like halfway through typing be like, Alexa, remind me to I don't know, submit a ticket for this thing. How do you kind of where do you see it going with AI in these to kind of perfect that, to affect the smoothness of that flow.
So I think in the long run, there's a huge amount of interesting stuff around biofeedback and understanding kind of things like eye tracking and understanding like when people are becoming distracted, potentially understanding what they're looking at, and then being like just flagging that automatically, and so you can trust that the machine's noticed that you've noticed.
Nice.
However, that's a fair way off yet.
Yeah.
And ubiquitous eye tracking has even more ethical considerations. So
I see you weren't looking at the right portion of your screen for 57% of the time.
exactly. Yeah. So this is a really good example of these huge ethical issues, and how much benefit we could give to people, because it could be a really great working environment. It just knows kind of what you're thinking to some level, and just organises things ideally for you to carry on working in the way that you're enjoying. So yeah, but in the short run, I'm not sure I can think of any. It's very interesting that you've kind of covered all of the things that I would have thought of. That speaking is an interesting one as a kind of lightweight, non-flow blowing kind of ending notation tool.
With this, on this point and going back earlier, were kind of mentioning the design of either the process or the product for both the consumer and the user. And so would this be a case of where, what would these be called? Like the user experience, like system analysis, design stuff, where you actually go and bring that whole corpus of either system design or user experience, human interaction, body of knowledge, and start fitting it more into your other design processes?
Yeah, this is about integrating some of the knowledge that we have, and at the moment a lot of that knowledge is very outward facing. So you work in a large organisation and you spend all of your UX effort on people who are effectively on your customers, which is great because that's where your revenue comes from. But what you're not doing is focusing on increasing the capability of the people inside the organisation. And so one of the things I'm particularly interested in doing is, as these tools develop kind of within the organisation, is turning those practices, turning that knowledge in more inwardly.
Because enterprise software does kind of have the reputation of being awful.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Enterprise software is just is often really hard to use, and that has a huge cost.
I was wondering, how do you think we can reassure employees of their value within a company when we implement an AI solution like bots?
Yeah.
You've talked about it.
Yeah. So because how you could protect employees from feeling that they were going to be replaced. I think that's down to the culture of the organisation and the way that these things are framed. And one of the interesting things, the positive side of this, is that computers are really good at doing the kind of dull, repetitive work that humans don't like. And there's still a whole load of dull, repetitive work in most people's jobs. So there's a big scope for people to automate away a lot of the stuff that they don't enjoy and focus on the things that they're really, really good at. But that implies a cultural change in organisations, that they can develop their people and have people kind of understand how to develop people, how to focus on people's strengths and the creativity and the skills that they really need. Now, the World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report also covered the likely skills necessary in these new workplaces, and they're much more around strategic thinking, systems thinking, creativity, emotional awareness, all of these kind of high-end complex skills, rather than task focus and kind of manual skills and all of those skills. And that's going to be the reason that happens is partly because those are the things that we can't automate. But you've got to have an organisation that's positive enough to focus on, developing those skills in people, making the organisational context such that people feel okay to be creative and can do stuff. Because, it's a huge challenge. But for me, it's about selling a positive vision of actually a much nicer working life. But you're right, there are plenty of organisations that will probably try and use this for cost minimisation.
So that sounds definitely like at the start of the talk when you were saying you did like stupid metrics.
Yep.
That basically, in a good organization, all the stupid metrics should be handed to the AI, and you should be focusing on things like soft skills and and promoting that kind of culture.
Yeah.
And you can't have stupid metrics in there, otherwise you can't have the culture that you need.
Precisely. That's exactly it.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. What when you focus on, when you reify measurement, it becomes the be all and end all of the organisation. You pick a specific measure and it's like everyone's focused on that, and it becomes a really big problem. It can even be a problem if you're focused on the bottom line, just at the exclusion of everything else, because people get very focused on like the next quarter, and then they're not thinking about where the company's going in a year or where the company's going in 2 years, and they miss the big opportunities that are further down the line because they're just focused on next quarter's results. So choosing metrics is extremely important, and choosing to measure there's one of the interesting things is how you can start to measure things that aren't immediately quantifiable. So we're looking at being able to measure a whole load of different things in the organisation, and different more human things around meaning, intention, mood, that we can't measure at the moment, that might well be good markers for the kind of culture that we want to create, for a creative culture, that's a generative culture. And if we're just measuring, as you say, the really simple metrics, we're not going to get there.
But in a way, the really simple metrics, I see this in an organisation where hierarchy is quite a big thing, and top management is not really interested in detail, and you want a kind of high-level view of everything.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make sure you can give enough context and detail to people who are not interested in context and detail? Because that's always an issue of being focused on things that are not simple, and thus making reporting and explaining things very difficult.
It is extremely challenging, because when you approximate something, when you simplify it, you're losing some of the subtlety. And that is going to be one of the big challenges for these tools. If you think about having a kind of cultural dashboard for the organisation, that could be a very positive thing, but it could equally be a hugely misleading thing. So without giving the correct context and without actually understanding where this stuff comes from, it could be really, really problematic. And that's doubly problematic when we're talking about black box AI again. Because you won't know what the basis of the decision actually was. So no, it's a big challenge, definitely, and an unsolved problem at the moment.
All right, no, any more questions? All right, well then, let's thank Matthew for his talk tonight.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Just very quickly for people on the live stream and for y'all, this is the last talk for the year. We should be starting back up sometime in February. And unfortunately, this will be our last meeting in this wonderful building because it will be closing at the end of December. The IET is no longer going to be running it. So I'll be passing along details once we have venues certain. We're pretty sure it's going to be Strathclyde University, and when we have details and stuff ironed out, I'll pass them all through on the mailing list. So have a good night. Thank you for coming.